A lot of people read novels to escape reality, but some novels escape so much from reality that they escape logic, they escape almost any sort of plotting, and they make you feel like you're dreaming. The seven novels that I'm going to talk about today are both classics and more modern fiction, and they each play with your sense of what to expect, as well as with standard plot and any sort of logical reality of what might happen next. I think there's tremendous value in these works in just really warping your mind and making you really think about what you're reading and really just exploring wholly new ideas and environments in ways that your brain might never have thought of before. It's basically like training your brain using puzzles, using brain teasers, using cryptic crosswords. It's just going to stretch your sense of logic as well as how you view the world. And I think they really show the power of fiction to use words to conjure things that your brain has a really hard time to grasp. In other visual arts, you're always going to have something physical to hold on to, whether it's CGI, whether it's painting, whether it's drawing. There'll be something, no matter how surreal, your brain is ordered to grasp onto. But in fiction, all of that power is held within your imagination and you're translating these words onto the page. And so the flow, the sequence of characters, the descriptions of anything are all just conjured by the words on the page. And the authors can really play with that. And I think all seven of these books really do that well, including the one graphic novel, which does, in fact, use art. So let's get started with an absolute classic, which is Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman. O'Brien was a mid-century Irish author, I think much more appreciated in his homeland than he has been internationally. He's a bit of one of those obscure classics which a lot of really good authors love, but he's never really made the huge jump into the mainstream. His most famous book is At Swim Two Birds, which is a super metafictional story, which is about an author who creates a book and his characters come to life and he starts to interact with them and it really plays with reality, but it is nothing compared to The Third Policeman. It also starts out a bit as a literary satire where our main character has written what he considers the seminal thesis on a subject, and he's sort of at a loss of what to do next, and he begins to wander the countryside, and he meets some characters. He contemplates potentially robbing a house, and the way that his life works becomes increasingly surreal. He goes into a house, and there are two policemen that basically only speak in non sequiturs about bicycles. There's a whole conversation about pronouns all the way in the mid century. So, anyone who thinks that conversations around pronouns are a new thing, that was used as a satire way back decades and decades ago. He finally meets the third policeman who has the face of another man. There's plays with lights, reality, whether people are alive or dead, including the narrator. And it does feel very dreamlike, but it also feels very nightmarish. I've heard people say that it is a comedy, but for me, it felt very much like I was trapped within a labyrinth where all the walls kept changing and nothing really ever made sense. O'Brien is a very talented stylist, and I think that really flows through the book because everything that the narrator experiences becomes increasingly obscured and muddy, which is reflected in this really wonderful writing that O'Brien does. The book is really hard to parse and interpret, and there's been a lot of academic theses written on it, but I think if you just sit down with something and you're absolutely unprepared to experience what O'Brien has in store for you, you're really in for a trip. If you're familiar with the films of Luis Buñuel, that sense of surreality and satire and just not having any idea what will come next, I think it was played really, really well here. And I think the themes about class and life and just the weirdness of bureaucracy and the Irish countryside are all really wonderfully evoked. But it is a novel that I just sat when I finished with, and I basically just read again because I had no idea what was happening. And the second time I read it, I think I understood even less. So, if you want to start with this book, I think this is a fantastic book that really makes you feel like you're dreaming, that really plays with the surreal, and is a classic for a reason. And now for a much more modern book, and I think a much more obscure pick than The Third Policeman. In fact, it only has, I think, a few dozen reviews on Goodreads. It is Nour Ali-Nakhoul's Supplication, which absolutely reads like a nightmare. This is not a dream. This is something that really plays with some of the most messed up thoughts. It starts out with the main character who experiences their own murder and then wakes up again, escapes, and tries to trace out everything that happens. They meet a bizarre woman who gives them a gun. They essentially give birth to an eel in a bathtub. They guzzle gasoline at a gas station. Everything has a nightmarish logic. We're not sure how the scenes transition from one to the other. They feel like when you're in a nightmare where everything just keeps getting wilder and weirder, and the previous scenes don't really have much of a logic with the scenes that follow until something that you thought was dropped all of a sudden reoccurs. And the book is one of those books which almost feels like horror, but I think plays so much with your sense of reality that it never feels grounded enough to really play with your sense of dread, other than the nightmarish images that pass back and forth. So it's a really unique book that is chopped up into these really interesting chapters, and it is unlike anything I have ever read. It is a very divisive book. In those few dozen reviews, there is a lot of praise and there is a lot of people who just had no idea what's going on, and I think that is to the book's benefit. I really think you should pick this up if you're into this sort of writing. If you are a bit of a horror fan, it is a really unique experience, and even if you're not into horror, if you're just into surreality, I think this book is really gonna just blow your mind in a really dark and interesting way, and I'm really excited to read any other work by this author just because it is so beyond anything I've read before. And now let's go back to the classics, and this is actually one of Mexico's most famous novels, or really novellas because it's quite short, and when I finally read it this year, I was actually very surprised that it had the reputation of being a classic because it is so utterly bizarre and transformative. It is Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo, and it is part of that vein which people have said is part of magic realism, but I'm not really sure that it even qualifies as magic realism because the realism falls apart immediately. Ostensibly, it is about a man who is seeking his father after his mother dies, and the father is Pedro Paramo. He goes to a town, and of course, Pedro Paramo is already dead, and everything that happens next just becomes even more bizarre. You meet characters mid-scene, and then Rulfo will suddenly jump back to introduce the character. He really plays with timelines. He'll even play with perspective. For those who read Spanish, you don't necessarily introduce the characters who are actioning the verb as long as it's in the third person. And so he will switch from our narrator to Pedro Paramo's perspective just from paragraph to paragraph. And so for a sequence, you're not even sure who is speaking or what timeline you're in. And that's not even getting into all the ghosts that our narrator encounters. The town he goes to is essentially a ghost town. There's no one there. And the people that he does encounter are revenants. And then about a third of the way through the book, our narrator basically dies and starts dreaming of the past and talking to other ghosts, and we switch to Pedro Paramo's perspective, and everything just is in a jumbled sequence of chronology, of perspective. Rulfo really plays with everything, and you never get a sense of anything to grasp on, but it really does chronicle a really interesting blend of religion, superstition, and folk tales, and it's a classic for a reason, but it is so utterly bizarre that I really wish other countries chose stories as weird and strange, as adventurous as this book, because it still blew my mind many decades later, and it still feels utterly new in ways that I think a lot of mid-century literature doesn't. So absolutely pick up Pedro Paramo. It is one of the weirdest books that I've read, just even for the chronology of introducing characters, let alone the subject matter. So absolutely pick it up. It is really weird, really fun, and I'm really glad that Mexico celebrates it. Let's keep going with novellas, but of course let's go into more modern fiction, and one that I think will be a future classic because it is by a Nobel Prize winner. It is Jon Fosse's Alice at the Fire. Fosse is a Norwegian author. I recently read his 800-page single-sentence work, Septology, which I wasn't as huge a fan of, but I absolutely loved Alice at the Fire, which in fact does a lot of the same tricks that Septology does, but in a much more compact form. It essentially follows multiple generations of a family that live by a fjord, and it alternates all of their perspectives. It has a male character named Alsa, there's Alice, a female character, grandchildren are named after grandparents, and you're switching perspectives in almost a stream-like flow because, of course, Fosse only uses a single sentence, and so you're just transported from paragraph to paragraph, from sentence to sentence, across decades of time, and various themes reiterate, from potential drowning to alcoholism to staring out across the shore at various fires and ghosts and thinking of people that might have disappeared, that are dead but are not dead in your memories. And I think it's a really interesting dream sequence because Fosse absolutely plays with reality and that sense of a family being stuck on a shore for so much time and the overlapping histories that really exist there. I think the book is really one of the most fascinating things that I've read. And because it's so compact, it doesn't exhaust you like septology did for me. So I think it's just one of those books that really uses its form to play with time and reality in something that's almost less jarring than Pedro Paramo because it is not sudden, it flows like the fjord outside the house. And I think it is just one of those books which uses its form so well to play with everything, and it feels delightfully modern and in a much more interesting way, I think, than a lot of novels that explore family history. It doesn't have that stodginess of really being stuck in historical fiction because Fosse just flows so beautifully. So absolutely check out that work. Maybe not check out Septology. I will do a video on it soon because I found it interesting despite its many flaws. But if you want to try to get into a Nobel Prize winner, I think Alice at the Fire is a fantastic way to start with Fosse and his interesting style. Next, we have one of my favorite writers' less successful works. So if you've seen my video on the best books that I read last year, Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus was by far my favorite book. I found it so fascinating and transporting and magical. And this is a recent reissue of another of her more obscure books. It's called The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman. And the book itself, I wasn't a huge fan of, but I think it does a lot of really interesting plays with reality and does really fit this surreal theme. And I know a lot of people really do like it. It did get a foreword by Jeff Vandermeer in this reissue. And I just think, hey, even if this isn't something for me, it might be for some other people. So this is a really fascinating book because it starts really mid-dream where our narrator is in the midst of a city which is besieged by these hallucinatory dreams, which the machines of Dr. Hoffman are absolutely just devastating reality, where at an opera show everyone turns into peacocks, streets change mid-direction just from hour to hour, lovers that you thought were gone come and resume your affairs, dead parents and lovers and family members come back, and it's just absolutely playing with reality. Our narrator is far too logical to fall to this, but his descriptions of these sorts of dream sequences, which become physical reality, no one can contemplate mirrors, are a really interesting dive, and that is only in the first 5 or 6 pages. But Hoffman isn't content to just chronicle the bizarre. We then have our narrator go on a series of adventures almost through a Freudian dreamscape in search of Dr. Hoffman, as well as Dr. Hoffman's daughter, Albertina, who might be the love of his life. And it is almost an exploration of the colonial imagination. He escapes and lives with some indigenous peoples, which have very bizarre rituals and interesting ideas about the age of consent. He travels to Africa with some really horrific stereotypes about violence in African people, but none of these are necessarily real. They're the imaginings of people which have escaped into the dreamscape, and so they are these colonial imaginings more than anything else. There's also a lot of sexual violence, which is experienced by both the narrator and by Albertina. Eventually, they go to a land which is populated by centaurs with the anatomy of the horses below, and that is very vividly described. But what's interesting with Hoffman is none of it is ever really that traumatic for the characters. It has that sense of dreamlike reality where things that should obviously be horrifying don't really affect everything as much. I've seen people describe this as a feminist work, but it is just playing so much with the dark imaginings of the imagination of British people about the exotic, about others, about the horrors and interests of sex, that I think it is one of those books that, even though it will make you very uncomfortable, it certainly made me uncomfortable, and I'm not sure it all succeeds. Something that you're really expecting to end in fireworks just sort of peters out into something that is not altogether all that satisfying. So for me, this was a bit of a miss, but I think there's enough to dig into that I'm confident that other people that read it might just find it really interesting and satisfying, even if for me it wasn't particularly that interesting because the colonial imagination is horrifying itself in and of itself, let alone when it's manifesting its own dreams and nightmares, but I think it's a really interesting swing for the fences. But I would still much more recommend Nights at the Circus than this. But hey, whatever floats your boat, this is Angela Carter, and I think she's always worth visiting. Next, let's return to Latin America, and again, for a book which is considered part of magic realism, but I think is so bizarre and interesting that it is much more dreamlike than it is with the likes of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It is Jose Donoso's The Obscene Bird of Night, which is considered almost a dark classic of Argentinian literature, and it essentially follows a single character whose perspective really shifts. He's called the Mute, and he lives in essentially a convent, and there's a lot of bizarre things that happen. There is a donkey mask which people put on and have sexual relations with this poor girl who is underage. There is attempts to birth a miracle child. There is a whole city of deformed people and monsters. None of it is at all really politically correct, and a lot of it will make you uncomfortable. But the way that Donoso really plays with perspective, so the mute's perspective will go from him to the head of this cardboard donkey to a Mother Superior character, and he's just sort of floating about and going into other perspectives that you almost lose the sense of his body, even though you're always very certain about the bodies of certain other characters. Like with Carter, a lot of the sex isn't really played to be traumatic. It's played to really explore with how much the author can push at you. And so I just think that the way that Donoso explores these themes is really interesting, really dark, and the way that he plays with timeline and perspective, you're never really sure if you're sitting on any sort of solid ground. And honestly, the book itself is a bit of a mess. It's very long, but the language is really descriptive and fascinating. There's a lot of religious themes, about sexual themes, themes about beauty as well as masculinity, femininity. But I think the way that the book succeeds most is the ending is so beautifully poetic and evocative in this really wonderful scene, which again plays with your perspective. I would just read it all the way to the end, even if you're not into it. It's a book that I promise if you soldier through and you get through to the end, you'll just be like, huh, and you'll want to reread it again. So it is, again, a book that is a little dark, that is going to make you uncomfortable, that is really going to play with your perspective in a way that feels very dreamlike, where all of a sudden you're shifting perspectives. But I think it is a classic for a reason, and it's gotten a bit more hype recently, I think, as people rediscover it. And I think it does for a reason. It is still a really unique book, again, many decades after its publication, much like Pedro Paramo, but I think it really deserves it. And finally, sort of throwing out everything I said before about the power of prose to conjure images in your mind, I wanted to highlight a really interesting graphic novel, which I think uses images to play with reality in really interesting ways. And this isn't going to be sort of a horror thing like we're talking about Junji Ito's Uzumaki, which really plays with images of spirals and nightmares. This is a much more gentle book, and it's by an author that I did not particularly expect to be gentle. It is Charles Burns, who wrote Black Hole, which is a really fascinating, really dark book, not just because of the inkiness of the drawings. It's a coming of age novel about a sexually transmitted disease, which can also potentially deform you. And it really uses that metaphor to play with the anxieties of your body changing, as well as you discovering sexuality in other people's bodies. It's a really fascinating book, which is sometimes classified as horror and does have a lot of darkness to it. So recently he came out with actually a color graphic novel called Final Cut. It was for sale at my local horror bookstore, and I picked it up expecting something really dark and traumatizing. And in fact, this is another coming of age novel, but just like with it being in color, it is a lot more vibrant and interesting than I was expecting. It follows a young male character who's a bit of a loner, who's really trapped in his own imagination, but he wants to make films, and he also has a crush on a beautiful red-haired girl. And what Burns does really well is he uses the images to play with a sense of reality, where we have our protagonist dreaming a lot of the time, and those dream sequences overlap with his sense of reality and what he's planning for his film, as well as his desires and contemplation of life and the bodies of others and how everything might change in any time. Interestingly, I think it is the heaviness of Burns's line work which really makes things feel very solid, which grounds his work, and the more surreal flights of fancy feel so lived in and so real that they really make you contemplate how this could actually occur. And I think the book is one of those books which is very gentle. It's much more subtle in its surreality than a lot of the other novels and novellas I've talked about here, but I think it's one that absolutely rewards revisiting and is really in touch with the subconscious of its protagonist and those anxieties of coming of age, as well as the ideas of aliens, of chrysalids, of transformation that were explored in Black Hole, but I think in this are explored in also a very interesting sci-fi way, as well as in a very dream sequence sort of way. So there you have it, 7 novels which I think will absolutely blow your mind and make you question your sense of what reality is if you're really looking to escape in literature and find something that will drift you off into your subconscious, into your pure imagination, and have you questioning anything that is real as well as your deepest desires and imaginings. I think these books will do that for you. As always, please put your own suggestion in the comments about books that are really going to sort of mess with your sense of reality. Like and subscribe if you like this sort of content, and I will be back again with more book recommendations because, again, I think literature is one of the very best ways to explore new ideas in a really interesting, accessible way, and I think all of these books do exactly that in ways that I don't see very often. So thank you for joining my book list, and I will talk to you soon.